Okay, hello. Thank you for coming to listen to me drone on this afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. In a previous life, I was responsible for selling of remote monitoring contracts, maintenance contracts, and full service contracts, and spent a number of years trying to successfully and failing to sell these contracts. So wanted to go through some of the best and worst things that we learned through that period. So yeah, my name's Roger Durham. Today I'm responsible for commercial operations, but I'm going back on my previous life in oil and gas and infrastructure, specifically large rotating equipment in the oil and gas industry. These are large, long life, sort of 20, 30, 40-year pieces of machinery that keep running for that length of time, big capital investment pieces, and there's an awful lot of money tied up in the maintenance and life cycle side of things as well. So just so you know where I'm coming from, if I start talking about different worlds, that's probably why. So, but it's an important piece within within those industries. I'm going to start quietly by totally turn everything on what you've just said on its head. But actually you were alluding to it very closely yourself as well anyway. You said something very, very similar, talking about the solutions. And that was echoed by a very well-respected marketing professor from Harvard many years ago, Theodore Levitt, who said, people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. They don't want to buy what you're selling. What they're trying to do is they're trying to drill a hole. That's the problem they have, and that is what they need the solution to. And so what I would argue is customers aren't actually trying to buy digital something. They actually have a problem that they're trying to deal with, and you're offering a solution. That solution may be digital, it may be practical engineering, it may be something else, but it's the problem that they're trying to find the solution to, and that's what you're trying to sell them, is that solution. So coming at it from that direction, what type of problem are we trying to solve? And this is something I grappled with when I was tasked originally with trying to bring these new service contracts onto the market and how to sell and market these remote monitoring contracts, these different full service contracts. What solution are we trying to deal with here? And I pulled them into various different buckets here. And the ones I came up with were some form of business case. So either a growth case or a savings business case. And we had some very interesting discussions at the last event in Dusseldorf, where we talked about the relative benefits of a cost type business case, where the savings that you're generally trying to bring for the customer are usually diminishing returns and smaller, but can be there, but it's a diminishing returns thing. And the big numbers are where you're trying to provide them a growth, an upsell, an add-on to what they're doing with their common business. So how can you bring a growth to them? Both are valid, but usually you get the bigger business case numbers with the growth type business cases. And we had some very interesting discussions there last time on that. But those raise questions like, what's the timeline on return on investment from the customer's perspective? What's their appetite for spending on those, either for the CapEx or for the operating expenditure, the maintenance budgets? And you touched on that with the total cost of ownership question, which is total cost of ownership is the CapEx plus the OpEx together over the full life of that machine or that unit. So that's one option, go at it in a business case perspective. Alternatively, they have to do it in some form. Either there's some government legislation, or they've just had an audit which has red flagged them for a number of things, and they have to go out and do something. They don't have a choice about it. The other thing, which I'll touch on in here in a minute, is recent failure. Recent failure where they've just had something which before would have been seen as a bit of a risk. All of a sudden, a bit of a risk is 100% probability. But I'll touch on that in a minute. The other thing is the concept, and this is my term, it's not, I've made it up, but insurance. That's different to insurance, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's playing on the insurance world and fear of failure and the cost versus the likelihood. Alternatively, and I've just thrown this in because I've probably forgotten something, there may well be something else out there. There's an interesting consultancy in the US that works on sales negotiation. They specialize in sales negotiation, and they're called the Black Swan Group. And they talk about these black swans, which are unknown unknowns or unknown knowns, which you don't know about. And how can you uncover what it is that the customer wants How can you uncover that? And then that becomes the key selling point. If you can understand what that is, that's in there somewhere. Not a topic for today. So where I started at the top of that list. I started with the sort of classical approach of business case, and this is how you can show savings to the customer. I had tons of very, very good, I believe, efficiency improvement use cases, of breakdown avoidance business cases where we could show quite significant savings with technical numbers, with euro value numbers behind them, where we've got all the data, everything else really, really, really powerful. Didn't really work. Very, very little interest. And we're like, what the heck's going on? We spent ages going through various different customers. We could show all of this data specifically for the types of machines they had. And in certain industries, it worked, but in other certain industries, it didn't. And we were trying to work out, I started trying to work out, okay, what's going on? Why is it not working in those industries? What started to come out when we started to try and bucket these things together is two things. Number one, ease of monitoring. For new machines, they were being sold with the remote monitoring packages either already installed or they were ready to be installed. So the cost of setting these things up and running them was almost zero or very low. And then it was just the incremental costs ongoing. For the old machines, going back to what I was saying, the 10, 20, 30-year-old machines, the cost of getting those upgraded to a state where they were capable to bring in the business case benefits we were talking about was so monumental, it killed the business case, basically. So knowing that, we started focusing primarily on new machines or less than 5-year-old machines first, and we stopped focusing with that particular business case approach on those older machines because it just didn't make sense. The other aspect was one that we had relatively little control over, but the customer sees a lot of, which is their perceived risk and the cost to them and their process of a failure. And specifically perceived risk is a very important thing in there, which you touched on earlier as well. What's the customer's risk perception? What's the likelihood they believe that that thing's going to happen? And that perception is often much, much lower beforehand than afterwards, which comes back to the audit trail and whether something's just happened. They've just had a shutdown. Because if they've just had an unplanned shutdown or a major problem, that's the time to go visit. Because all of a sudden that percentage is all of a sudden 100% likelihood. But what we realized is we were having very good success in this area up here, where there was high monitoring ability and high risk of failure and or high cost failure. That bit we were having a lot of success in. And you can see this from the way the customers manage their maintenance strategies. Different customers, even on the same site, different machines may have different maintenance strategies, depending on how they perceive the importance of those machines. So some that are totally core to their main core processes within their industry or whatever it is they're trying to do. Baggage handling we were talking about earlier. They would be much more interested and they would be carrying out predictive style maintenance and very focused maintenance activities on those machines. Other non-critical ones, which they can quite happily survive without for a couple of days or weeks or whatever. Maybe they have some spare machines on the side, which are just sitting there redundant most of the time. They will run those to failure. They're not interested in spending what they would see as being expensive maintenance budget on those sort of machines. So understanding where the customer's at in his or her mindset and what those machine criticalities are. If I'd have known that beforehand, I would have saved an awful lot of door knocking, and I would have stopped trying to go and approach these ones. I started looking up here in the sort of green areas up the top here. These ones we were already working on. I was tasked with trying to do these ones here, and that's sort of how I tried to do that, to try and understand it, to try and sort out the ones with the higher likelihoods first. So that brings us then to the concept of risk. If I've killed off the business case question, the next question then is risk. To traditional insurance, and we're sitting in Frankfurt at the moment, all these tall buildings around here, half of them are finance, banking, insurance industry, and what have you. This is then what I would call commercial insurance. It's all about insurance against lost money. If something happens, they have some monetary and commercial conditions in place, and they will provide compensation, hopefully, after an event has happened. And it's about giving you money to pay back the monetary cost that you've lost due to something happening, be it a breakdown, be it a cybersecurity thing, whatever. But it's all about money, compensation for lost production. What I was talking about and what we're talking about in technical services world, when we're talking about service contracts, it's my term, but I think I should probably patent it, insurance. You're ensuring the resilience of the customer's production. It's not about dealing with it afterwards with money, specifically. It's more about providing the maintenance, materials, labor, commercial conditions, technical solutions in place before, during, and after, hopefully to avoid things happening in the first place, or to help fix it as quickly and painlessly as possible if it happens. Those two things are quite different when you think about it in those terms. But it's about predicting, about aiding as fast and painless resolution if something comes up, so guaranteed field service response times, making sure they've got spare parts available on site, in country, or availability, maybe some online intervention as we talked about before, but it's a mixture of all of these things together, digital services for the online intervention, plus the spare parts, plus, pulling that whole thing together to making sure that you can ensure the resilience of production. And that's all about risk, basically, the cost and likelihood of what they see as being risk. So it's more thinking about something like this from the perspective of being a banker and calculating the probabilities rather than our traditional engineering mindset of here's a piece of metal with some nice features, please will you sell it? So who knows what a blind shear ram is? A blind shear ram sits on the bottom of the ocean. It sits over the top of the pipe coming out of an oil well at the bottom of the ocean. It's the last ditch fail-safe device that's there to close off the oil pipeline if something's gone wrong. Okay, it just sits on the bottom of the ocean. It's an emergency unit. Hopefully it's never used. It just sits there just in case. According to the industry general perceived knowledge at the time, and I'll come to that in a minute, the failure rate of these things was around about 5%. If you want to change one of these things out because it's deep underwater and you need to send down submarines and it's all very complicated, it's anything up to 5 million euros to replace it once it's down there. It's only used in an emergency. Would you pay for expensive digital monitoring for an item like this if you were the boss of a major oil and gas firm? Probably not. Understandably, based on the information in front of you. Who's heard of Deepwater Horizon? Can you guess which part failed? So after that event, there were studies done and there was a whole big change in the industry. A number of things happened. Obviously, there was legislation changes, so now you had to do something, and that is obviously an open door that you can then start going to speak to these customers about. I mean, I'm not trying to sell blind shear rams here. This is just an example to give, just to show the point. But there was a major legislation change. The customers have to do something, but also very importantly, that perception changed. There were a number of new studies done. The original studies were based on studies on land in lab conditions that said 5%. You probably saw it in the news. As soon as you put that part down deep underwater under high pressures, that the failure rate of these things suddenly went up astronomically, and it was more like 40 to 50% failure rate on these things. So that was found out after the event. And at that point, the perception massively changed. So all of a sudden, your risk insurance calculation totally changes. Having that conversation beforehand was very difficult. Having the conversation afterwards, I would imagine, would be very easy. But the question is, how can you then change that up front before these things have happened? And this is one of the challenges I had. This was one of my customers. This was an LNG ship sitting offshore. Its role is to sit there and offload from passing LNG carriers and transport it into the country pipeline system. So it's sitting there waiting to offload shipments. So most of the time it's sitting there. It's not being used. Similar to the blind shear ram, it's not being used half the time. And then every now and again, a ship will come past and they'll offload 65 million euros worth of LNG. So when that happens, it has to work. But they've got a lot of time for that to actually be prepared and sat around and what have you. So on top of that, it's LNG, which is a very, very clean gas. It's highly processed. It's been prepared in sites, and it's coming through and it's now being transferred in. So the business cases I had before were all about dirty gas clogging up the system. Those business cases don't work anymore because it's a clean thing. It's being used periodically, so it's not a critical part which has to run 24/7 in a traditional way, but it does have to run 24/7 when they are doing their offloading processes. What I did have is they had a fear of failure during those focused operation periods. For that 48 hours or so, when it's running, it has to run. And they've got all the other time to do maintenance work and whatever they want on it. The other thing I had was the knowledge of the project manager who was involved and led the new unit installation. And what I did, for many of you, if you guys are working as services for an OEM, you'll have access to those people. And what I did is I sat down with that person and I went through everything that went wrong. Everything that went wrong during the installation commissioning period and what could be a risk for the future. And sat down with them and said, okay, what have we got? Having listed all that lot out and worked out where we saw potential problems, I managed to get a meeting with the boss of the boat and sat down and went through that lot with him, with the project manager sitting next to me, and led that meeting. And out of that, we were able to change that perception about what those risks were based on the real knowledge using the person that, of course, had been involved before. Not a conversation I could have had myself, I point out. I needed the other guy with that detailed knowledge. But with that, I was able to change that risk perception. And all of a sudden, the clean gas, never a problem because it's only used occasionally, 5% likelihood of failure, was sufficient then to change them to, okay, yes, maybe we better get something just to be sure. So that is how I approached the insurance or insurance approach. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it was an interesting sort of aha moment for us to try and bring that into a new market of what was traditionally very difficult to sell into because it was a clean gas operation. So maybe it's relevant for some of your areas as well. Another one which we found was a very interesting one. When a client came to us, they were looking to build a new refinery. And they were looking to build that refinery from scratch, but they wanted it unmanned. So no people on site, the odd maintenance personnel and what have you, but fundamentally no people in the control room and no people running around. Totally new way of working for them. And a totally different way of doing things because all of a sudden it needs to be run by computers. So the question from them to us at new unit stage, when they were doing the very, very original planning from their CEO level was, how can we do this on the total cost of ownership approach? So it's the full life cycle question. And we then started having a conversation with their senior management about the full life cycle. And we then had conversations around the CapEx budget, not the OpEx budget, and how can we make this full concept that they had make sense for them. And exactly the same as what you were saying before. I mean, we saw this with the previous slide, the 65 million euros. It wasn't really a question of money. There was money there, but not if I spoke to the maintenance team. The money was elsewhere. Exactly the same here. Once their maintenance budget's set, they won't have maintenance available to pay for a service contract. But if you speak to the senior people, the stakeholders at this level, and you can provide them the solution that helps them with their unmanned service problem, then all of a sudden there's a massive, massive budget available and it separates you apart. So very, very different, interesting ways of doing things, and totally different ways that I found as a learning point as well, and hopefully interesting for you. What we found is a number of different things. We talked about the savings business cases before. If you can get into a life cycle total cost of ownership type conversation, we deliberately started talking together with the new unit product businesses up front to try and capture the growth business cases and try and capture the life cycle conversations, so that you're having conversations with the bigger senior management people about the total cost of ownership rather than the maintenance savings. To do that, you need to have much bigger numbers on the table, which means growth business cases. If you've got those bigger numbers on the table, you've got a better chance of having a successful conversation with those correct stakeholders in the room. Specifically around the digital services, and I'll probably see some nodding of heads in a minute as I say this, there's usually conversations around, oh, we would love to, but GDPR blocks us, or oh, we would love to, but data security blocks us, oh, we would love to, but da. Yes, but usually the actual real proper concerns that are out there are largely due to lack of understanding by the operational people rather than real IT digital problems in the background. If you sit one of your own IT people together with one of their IT people, usually those problems can be resolved relatively easily, particularly these days because there's much more openness to do these types of things and cloud systems and what have you. There's ways to do these things technically, but you need to get the right people in the room to have those conversations. So get those correct people together. The other thing is then about understanding what their risk, their pain, their least attractive alternative is. So what are they giving up, as you talked about before? What are you giving up in order to go with this? What are they trying to achieve, and what's their other pain? If you're talking about insurance, you're talking about risk. What are they scared of? And what are you trying to sort of sell as a pain potential to them? What I'm coming up with here is you need lots of different stakeholders in here. And if you can put together as large a business case as possible so that you can get contact with as higher person in the organization as possible, but also the other stakeholders that you need as well. So the maintenance person, the IT person, anybody else you would need in those organizations to get that and understand what their business model is, what their pain is. That's the better way of doing it that we found. I'm not claiming I'm an expert, but at least that's what we found. And the other thing is then about not just the technical features and what have you, which we traditionally would have sold as an engineer, but also the risk aspect and the banker side or the insurance sales side of things. Nobody's fallen asleep. That's a good sign. Hopefully that was interesting for some of you. Fantastic. Thank you very much.